Hello and welcome to Subject to Change with me, Russell Hogg. My guest today is Giles Milton. Giles is one of Britain's best known and most popular narrative historians. Giles has been on the podcast before when we talked about the Barbary Corsairs and the story of Thomas Pellow, who was captured off the coast of Cornwall and enslaved back in 1716. But Giles has written on an incredibly wide range of subjects, and I think one of my favourites, though it's an absolute tragic story, is his book on the destruction of Smyrna by the Turks back in 1922. In recent years, he's been looking at aspects of World War II and its aftermath, with his latest being the Stalin Affair, which is a really remarkable look behind the scenes at the inner workings of the alliance between the Western Allies and Stalin. But today, we're going to go all the way back to the late 1500s, early 1600s, to talk about how the English battled with other European nations for control of the spice trade. And this is the story from Giles's book, Nathaniel's Nutmeg. And I think that may actually have been his first or one of his first books. And I remember it coming out at the time. So it's such a pleasure to have Giles on to talk about it. Anyway, welcome, Giles, to the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be back on again.
So as I say, today's podcast is all about the spice trade and about nutmeg in particular. But, so I went and had a look in my cupboard. And yes, I do have one or two spices in there, but I didn't pay very much for them. And I can't remember the last time I had any nutmeg. So I think my first and obvious question is why were spices such a big deal that people were prepared to, they were prepared to die for them?
I think it was partly because they were so rare. The spices, the nutmeg, the cloves, the peppers, all sorts of these spices came from, where did they come from? No one really knew until the end of the 1500s, beginning of the 1600s, when it was discovered that they grew on the spiceries, the fabled Spice Islands out in the East Indies, today's Indonesia. But those islands, they were very remote. They were a very long way from Europe. And this made spices incredibly expensive. They were the ultimate luxury. If you wanted to show that you had a lot of wealth, if you wanted to really be ostentatious about it, you would have a bowl of pepper or a bowl of nutmeg as the centerpiece of your table. This is the Elizabethan age. This is where people like to show off, flaunt their wealth, if you like. And that was one way of doing it. But it was more than that. Spices were believed to cure ailments. Any ailment under the sun, it was said, could be cured with spices. Anything from dysentery to the plague could be cured by a bit of nutmeg, bit of cloves, bit of cinnamon, whatever. And so they were incredibly valuable. And the other thing, of course, is that everyone said they were an aphrodisiac. They were the Elizabethan Viagra. And so with all that sort of multitude of benefits, they became very valuable and very sought after.
And I guess because people always think of the British Empire as being so dominant, until I sort of read a bit more, I always assumed that England had always been a great imperial power. But really, initially, the English are absolutely nowhere. It's all about Portugal and Spain. And really, it's just Portugal, at least at first in the Indian Ocean and in the Spice Islands.
Yeah, the Portuguese and subsequently the Spanish were way in advance of England. Little England on the fringes of Europe. We were doing nothing in terms of sailing around the world in the late 1400s, the early 1500s. The Portuguese had really carved out a monopoly with these galleons that were sailing around the world. They were by far the first to get to India, to get to the East Indies, to get to Japan. And, in one of the key treaties in history, which is very little known about now, was the Treaty of Tordesillas, which came about in 1494, where the Pope rather boldly divided the world into two and said to the Spanish, you can have one half, and the Portuguese, you can have another. And so they viewed the world has been divided into these two spheres of influence, and they went all out to sail to these far corners of the world and to colonize them. So long before the English or the Dutch entered the game, you've got these two great global powers fighting over far-flung pieces of land.
Well, you say fighting over. I suppose the treaty makes sure they're not fighting over them. They're kind of trying to avoid each other. Except the Magellan, he goes around the other way, and nobody's quite sure where the line is on the other side of the globe, are they?
That's a rather wonderful thing. This is a time in history where maps are far from accurate. In fact, I love looking at maps from this period and trying to identify various islands by the vague shapes that are drawn on them. And of course, the maps are adorned with sea monsters and all sorts of sort of animals that they think they're going to meet out there. So yeah, highly inaccurate maps, which means it's extremely difficult to find these places, especially if you're looking for an island that is just a few miles wide, that's covered in nutmeg trees or clove trees.
Well, this is the other thing I sort of took from your book, is that these islands, they're the place the cloves and the nutmeg grow, and they don't seem to grow really anywhere else. And these are tiny, tiny specks in the ocean. It's quite extraordinary.
Yeah. So nowadays, nutmeg grows all over the place, in the tropics anyway. But back in the 1600s, nutmeg quite literally only grew on 6 islands in the world. And that is the Banda Islands. These were out in the East Indies. They're between Indonesia and Australia. They're controlled by Indonesia. But these islands, they're volcanic islands. They're very small, tiny little archipelago. And one of the key islands, which we'll come on to talk about, the island of Run, it's only a couple of miles long and 1 mile wide. It's tiny. And, when you're sailing from England, a 3-year voyage to get there, and then you've got to actually find this place. So they were very, very remote, very badly charted. They were surrounded by coral reefs and shoals of all sorts of dangerous shoals of rocks and everything. So, this was a very, very hazardous undertaking, was to try and sail to these islands.
So the Portuguese, and I think when I was speaking to Roger Crowley about how they came into the Indian Ocean, he said sort of they came in with their visors lowered. Sort of, they were a pretty aggressive bunch, and in a very short time they're all the way out to what we now call the East Indies, I guess. But they must have been pushing out somebody. There must have been. I mean, because we were getting spices before that, albeit in a very inefficient way, but we were getting spices into Europe. So there must have been an existing trade that was going on that the Portuguese were sort of muscling in on and muscling people out.
Well, the traditional trade, of course, was overland, the fabled spice route. And that was literally, spices came from these islands to the Indian subcontinent. From India, they cross all the way across, what is now Iran and Turkey, etc., and make their way to Eastern Europe. And so actually, even if you look at, Chaucer in the Canterbury Tales, he talks about ginger and spices of the East. So they were available, but they were vastly expensive because every time they passed through a middleman, the price sort of doubled. So by the time they got to Venice, they were extremely expensive. And then the Venetian traders hiked the prices even more. And this is really why the Portuguese and Spanish went off. They decided to try and find the source of these things so they could undercut the Venetian merchants and carve out a sort of monopoly of sorts on this incredibly expensive commodity.
I just finished doing a podcast on the Venetians and the Fourth Crusade, and so following that story, my sympathy for the Venetians being undercut is fairly muted. Let's put it like that.
Yes.
We said that England is quite feeble, and I mean, there was an English expedition under Sir Francis Drake that got out to the Spice Islands. I think I noted it down as 1577. But even that's sort of a long time after the Portuguese have arrived. And my sense is that Drake seems to sort of exemplify the English approach, which is fairly small scale. It's sort of half peaceful trading, it's half piracy in a kind of a way, but there's nothing systematic about it. There's nothing terribly well financed about it. Is that sort of fair enough?
Yeah, and I think it's worth pointing out that Drake, to the Spanish and Portuguese, he was the pirate. He was literally known as the pirate because when he went on these expeditions, as soon as he came upon a Spanish seaport on the coast of South America, he'd ransack it, And there's this very sort of blurred line in Elizabethan seafaring between piracy, which is literally lawless going out and ransacking other people's ships and ports, and privateering, which was this peculiar thing, which is almost like state-sponsored piracy. So Queen Elizabeth I would allow Francis Drake or Walter Raleigh or whatever to sail off and ransack and attack Spanish boats, and sort of it was sort of deniable. So nothing was ever put down on paper. So she'd support these expeditions. She'd give money and buy into their ships and everything. But if they got into trouble, she said, "Oh, nothing. It was nothing to do with me. I didn't have anything to do with it." And this was privateering. And it was a sort of rather brilliant way of the Crown sponsoring piracy against the Spanish.
There's another thing I didn't really understand in all this, and I'm not sure I understand it yet. It's how you get to own stuff in European eyes, because it seems to be, well, sometimes you're the first to put up a building, ideally a fort, and sometimes it seems like you have to do a deal with the existing inhabitants. Maybe it's a deal with the threat of force behind it, but nonetheless, you have to have some kind of a deal. And other times, it just seems to be straightforward force and conquest. How do the Europeans sort of come to take control and come to take legal ownership? And how do they settle their disputes amongst themselves? Is it just a mess, or is there something legal going on there?
Well, I think there's something legal in their terms. These explorers going out there, these adventurers, they see it as legal. So what they will do typically is, and we see this, for example, with Jamestown when they sail over to Virginia and settle the first permanent colony in North America. They literally go with a flag, which they plant on the beach. They put up a plaque saying this land belongs to King James. And they try and induce the local inhabitants, the indigenous population, to sign a proclamation, which, of course, they don't understand because it's written in English, but they sort of persuade them or bribe them into signing it, which invariably they do. And then they wave this around and say, hey, this land is now ours. I mean, it literally is, it's as lawless as that. And that we see repeated over and over again on islands in the East Indies and all over the place. But there's absolutely no legal grounding to any of this. You can't just plant a flag and say it's mine now. So what they had to do generally is to build a fort and bring in soldiers and subjugate the local population and control these places by force. And this ultimately is what the Dutch were very, very good at.
Yes, the Dutch are much better organized than the English. But I was interested in the fact that the Portuguese come on to the Dutch in a minute, but the Portuguese, they found their way around Africa. I can't remember exactly when they got round, but it was about the time that Columbus finds America. It's almost contemporaneous, and so that's a fairly sensible way to get to India. But the English seem to have this fixation that they'll try and get to the East Indies by the northern route, and I just find this quite difficult to understand because the north it's just a frozen wasteland, and I'm thinking about Hugh Willoughby and Richard Chancellor in particular and their expedition. You just think, well, what were they thinking about?
Well, if you look at a map of the world, it's not entirely stupid what they were trying to do, because the sea route to Japan, to the Pacific, to the East Indies, actually, if you could sail across, what we now know as the Northwest or Northeast passages, you actually shave a massive distance off the route going via the Cape of either South Africa or South America. So on paper, it's not a bad idea. The problem is, as you've alluded to, is that these seas are invariably frozen for most of the year, and they are incredibly dangerous and treacherous. And one wonders why they didn't realize this. But as you mentioned, in 1553, the English send an expedition which is going to go over the top of Russia. And it's run by it's commanded by two gentlemen, adventurers, Richard Chancellor and Sir Hugh Willoughby. And they set off with high hopes of having quite a quick journey down to the spiceries. They're going to beat the Portuguese and Spanish at their own game by going on the northern route, where, it should be pointed out, there are no Portuguese castles, forts to be worried about, no Portuguese ships. So they see this as an ultimately sensible route to take. But unfortunately, they do, as they're sailing across the Northwest Passage, winter comes upon them and they find themselves frozen in. And the inevitable happens. They're in wooden ships, which don't behave very kindly when they're in pack ice, which is squeezing against the timbers. And of course, the ships get completely crushed and they're never going to sail again. And there's a very wistful account of rescuers some years later coming across Sir Hugh Willoughby's ship, and they're all his men are frozen on board. They find them in the ship, trapped in the ice, crushed. It's never sunk. It's just stuck in the ice permanently with all these corpses on board, and they've written their last wills and testaments and everything. Terribly tragic story. That's Sir Hugh Willoughby. That's his ship. Richard Chancellor was slightly more, how should we say this, get up and go. He realizes they're in big trouble. Their ship's going to be crushed. They're all going to die. So he actually leads his men overland, and they cross the White Sea. They cross onto into Russian territory, and they end up in Moscow, and they end up at the court of Ivan the Terrible. And there's this absolutely splendid account of the sort of barbarous splendor of having a banquet at Ivan the Terrible's court. And although, they don't get to the East Indies, something important does happen out of this voyage, because out of this voyage, trade with Russia begins. Not just trade with Russia, but the English form the Muscovy Company, which is a precursor to the East India Company, which is going to start exploiting the East Indies. So an important moment in history, this expedition, which is a total disaster in the sense it gets crushed in the ice, nevertheless leads to the formation of an international trade with Russia.
And we call him Ivan the Terrible, but I'm not sure that's completely fair at this stage, because I think it's a bit like Henry VIII. I think Ivan the Terrible gets worse and worse with age.
Yeah.
And at this stage, I think I don't know when he died, but he was born in 1530. So by the time they turn up, he's only 25. So I think he's probably quite good fun at that stage, at least if you're on the right side of him. And, maybe in another 20 years' time, it would have been a different story.
He actually asks him, he suggests that he should get married to Queen Elizabeth I and goes back, sends her back with a kind of wedding proposal, which, needless to say, Elizabeth declines.
Well, that would have been great history if she would have said yes. I don't know. Did monarchs get married like that? I always thought it was princesses married monarchs.
Well, I don't know. It would have been the ultimate arranged marriage, anyway.
That would have been quite something. And then there's another sort of northern voyage, which is later, but it's quite interesting because it's Hudson's voyage, and it's actually a Dutch expedition. Hudson is English. It's a Dutch expedition. It should have been a French expedition, but the French were a bit slow in sort of getting the funding there. And then it's an absolute theme of your book. Hudson promptly, completely disobeys all his orders and heads off almost in completely the opposite direction that he's faithfully promised. I thought that was just so interesting.
Yeah, and actually mentioning Hudson and the Dutch is interesting that we tend to forget that often, certainly the Dutch ships had very international crews, and there were people from all different countries in Europe in these things. So the crews were multilingual. And I think of, William Adams, who was the first Englishman to set foot in Japan. He was sailing with the Dutch fleet. So they were quite happy to have him along because he was a very good pilot, piloting ships into very little known seas. So, yeah, these were international expeditions at the time.
The Hudson expedition, it isn't a complete failure. I mean, although they sort of go the wrong way, they do make interesting discoveries. I think off the east coast of America, right?
Yeah, well, it ultimately means these expeditions that the Dutch sent out to America ultimately means that the Dutch start grabbing bits of territory on the North American continent. And this is the very beginnings of, settlements there and everything. So an important moment in the history of exploration.
The English, they've got bits of North America, but it's such a huge, long coastline. You can be hundreds of miles from each other and sort of building up your own particular base.
There was an English explorer, Thomas Derner, I think his name was, who sailed into what is now Manhattan, and he thinks this is quite a nice island, and is quite surprised to discover that the Dutch are already there and they're trading in furs. This was the interest at the time in that part of North America was the fur trade, which of course was worth a lot of money, not quite the same as spices, but nevertheless an important commercial enterprise.
And the other thing that I really noticed in the book is that the Dutch are very punctilious. I mean, it's kind of what you were saying before, but when they land in Manhattan, they're very punctilious to get the land grant from the local people. And they have instructions: make sure you get it in writing, make sure it's all signed, make sure you pay for it, which I thought was interesting. But I guess it's as much to defend themselves against other Europeans. These grants are not so much to defend yourself against the local people who you're going to brush aside, presumably because you have so much greater firepower. But when somebody else turns up and tries to grab it, you can say, look, I own it. It's all nice and legal.
Funny enough, I've been looking into this recently for a new project I'm doing. It's very, very ambiguous. Who gets to claim what? Particularly if it's unoccupied, if it's completely a sort of isolated island or whatever. Is it simply by virtue of first discovery that you can claim it's yours? Some people said yes, some people said no. Or do you have to plant a colony there? That was widely held to be the way you claimed land. You couldn't just plant your flag on the beach. You actually had to send people there to live in the place, But this, I think you're absolutely right. They didn't really care at all about the native populations. And what they did care with their fellow European powers, that they could say, hold on a minute, we got a bit of paper saying that we own this bit of land and therefore you can't come there. So it was to cover their backs at home rather than when they were out there.
Mm. And then I mentioned that Hudson's voyage is a Dutch one. And really, I hadn't realized until quite recently just how powerful and successful the Dutch were. I mean, they are really, really good at this kind of thing. And I'm just wondering, what do you think is the secret of the Dutch success?
Partly, they were brilliant seafarers and they knew how to build really sturdy ships. That was incredibly important. But what is going to become ultimately the most important thing of all, both for the Dutch and ultimately for the English as well, is that they come up with this idea of a joint stock company. Now, hitherto, if you wanted to sail across to the other side of the world, you had to be very, very wealthy. You had to get Queen Elizabeth on board. And you had to get money to finance a ship and its crew for a voyage that's likely to take at least 3 years, if not 4 or 5. So you had to be extremely wealthy. And if that ship sunk, you lost everything. And that was not a great way of doing international business. The idea that came up with the East India Company and the Dutch East India Company is that you have multiple people investing limited amounts of money into a ship or a series of ships sailing overseas. And if those ships came back, you divided up the profits according to how much you'd invested in it. And this joint stock principle changed everything because it meant suddenly it was much more feasible to launch not just ships to the other side of the world, but entire fleets to the other side of the world. And this was the beginnings. The East India Company, founded in 1600, chartered by the Queen, and the Dutch East India Company just a couple of years later. And of course, the Dutch got off to a much more flying start than the English. But this was the principle that underpinned both companies, and it changed everything.
I'm not quite sure, but I get the impression that the East India Company, yes, it was joint stock, which, as you say, to gather in the money from all these separate people and then share out the profits. But it was expedition by expedition, so they were always running out of money. They didn't have permanent capital. They kept having to pay out. I'm not sure if the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, I'm not sure when they became more like a traditional company where your investment is permanent, as it were, and they can decide when to pay you out and when not to pay you out, and they can decide when to retain your capital for the next big thing, as it were.
I'm not sure when that came about. I do know you're absolutely right with the English expeditions. It was expedition by expedition. If your 5 ships came back and they were laden with spice, you sold it all and you got a massive cash windfall. I don't think, certainly not in the early decades, there was no concept of investing back into the company as a whole. You're right, it was investing into individual expeditions.
And I don't really want to badmouth the home team, as it were, the English, but we do seem to be quite bad at it. Because the Dutch seem to be much more unified, and the whole country and the whole government, they were all behind it. But reading your book, Elizabeth was probably quite keen, but James was much less keen. It was quite difficult. And you had the merchants on the one hand and the aristocracy on the other hand, and they were kind of almost fighting against each other. There's a sense that the English are disorganized in a way that the Dutch aren't.
Yeah, and also the English continued to send out privateers at this time. So the East India Company fleets were competing against individual ships, which made life extremely difficult out in the Indian Ocean. I think you're right. I think there was a much more discipline with the VOC, the Dutch East India Company. They imposed a structure from above. And if you were sailing to the East Indies, you had to sail under the auspices of the VOC, the Dutch East India Company. There were no private missions going off at the same time.
Yeah, it must have been quite something when the English sail into port, sort of, waving cheerfully, and they only to discover that, a privateer has been there the week before, sinking everything in sight.
Yes. I mean, the Dutch, of course, also controlled the Cape of Good Hope, which was an extremely important watering and revictualling centre. And the English did go there, and they did buy sheep and pigs and filled up their water casks there. But the Dutch did, that was a major bonus or plus point in their favour when they were sailing to the East Indies.
There was one expedition I was thinking of because I thought it was a terribly interesting one. Actually, it's a bit unfair to pick on it because the people on board were actually quite competent. But somehow Sir Henry Middleton's expedition, which I think is the 6th fleet the English send out in 1610, it all goes horribly wrong. I mean, it's quite extraordinary, but this guy, he's been sent out to the Spice Islands and he ends up in jail in the capital of Yemen.
It's actually probably worth spelling out the full horror of these voyages, first of all, of which this is a fabulous example. But, these ships are pretty small. They're the length of a couple of, London buses. You've got to crowd hundreds of men on board because so many are going to die on the route that you need to be able to replenish the crew. The hazards in the Atlantic are obviously storms, tempests, very dangerous to get into those. They are also no less dangerous are the doldrums, the infamous area of the mid-Atlantic where there is no wind at all. If you get caught in the doldrums, you're not going anywhere in a sailing ship. They are eating salt pork and hardtack. Pretty horrible diet. The hardtack was the clues in the name. They were really incredibly hard to bite into these baked biscuits. The water was soon so foul that men talk about having to sieve the water through their teeth to sieve out the flora and fauna that's growing in the barrels, Scurvy was rife. They hadn't yet discovered the idea that if you took vitamin C, if you sucked on oranges and lemons, which were plentiful in many of the islands like the Azores, then you would keep scurvy at bay. They got dysentery on board, a particularly nasty thing to get on when you're on board ship. So these voyages were not for the light-hearted. And I have to say, when I was researching the book, I thought, why the hell would anyone ever go on these voyages? But you realise how miserable life must have been in London at the time, particularly London, but other seaports, particularly if you were a younger son and you had no chance of inheriting the family, what money the family had. If you wanted to have a hope of enriching yourselves, well, why not take the chance on one of these voyages? But as you alluded to, the voyage of Sir Henry Middleton, I mean, it goes wrong on numerous points. But when they come to the port of, when they come to Aden on what is now Yemen, they call there. And what happens is the entire crew basically gets arrested and thrown in jail. And actually, I think if I've got there's a wonderful account. Sir Henry Middleton, who's this rather grand aristocrat, he finds himself basically being put into an underground dungeon. And he says here, he says, I was put in a chain and collar. A great pair of fetters were clapped upon my legs, he says, and manacles upon my hands. And I was so separated from the rest of the company, they stowed me all that day in a dirty dog's kennel under a pair of stairs. My lodging was on the hard ground, my pillow a stone, and my companions to keep me awake were grief of heart and a multitude of rats. And so this was simply because he'd offended the local governor of the place. And he's going to spend quite a long time in prison with all his crew. And it's many months before they negotiate their escape from prison, get back on board their ship, and they have their revenge by firing up their cannon and blasting at the town on the shore.
Yeah, no, it was an absolutely terrific story. I particularly liked it when the sort of march to the capital to see the Sultan, I guess. and they say, well, you better wrap up warm for the visit. And they're looking at, how sweltering Aden is. They, no, we don't need anything. The frost the snow begins to fall as they go up and up and up into the mountains. So they think, oh, what were we thinking?
I actually, many years ago, I'd been to Sana'a, which is now the capital of Yemen, and it is high up in the mountains. And yes, they couldn't believe it when they find themselves in a snowstorm in their very flimsy sort of Hessian vests and what have you. And so anyway, they eventually get underway and they eventually make it to Java. And it's worth pointing out that Java is the great port for both the Dutch and the English in the East Indies. This is, if you like, their central hub. And it's from here that they then sail off on shorter voyages to the other islands of the East Indies. So Bantam, the port of Bantam on the island of Java, is very near today's Jakarta, is the centre of all sort of operations of the spice trade.
The Dutch, all this time, they've been actually getting on with things where the English have been, I don't know, they've been disorganised, they've not been well financed, but the Dutch, they're forging ahead, they're building forts, forcing themselves on the indigenous people with considerable ruthlessness. But somehow the English, they've got some kind of a foothold on one or two of the islands. Is that right?
Yeah, that's true. And in fact, the Middleton's voyage is important in the sense that among the many mariners on board, there is a trader, Nathaniel Courthope, whose name gives the title to my book, Nathaniel's Nutmeg, because he's one of a group of men who then sail from Bantam on the island of Java. They sail further east, quite a few considerable distance, weeks of sailing, and they get to the Banda Archipelago, which are these 6 islands, which I mentioned before, the only 6 islands in the world where nutmeg grows. And the Dutch had already controlled a number of these islands. They built forts on them. As you said, they were utterly brutal with the local population. Total subjugation was the order of the day. But a couple of these islands were not controlled by the Dutch. The most westerly in the group of the Banda Islands, and one of those was called Run Island, Pulau Run. And this was the island to which Nathaniel Courthope and his group of men, they went there and they were determined to keep one island under English control, because by doing that, they would prevent the Dutch having a global monopoly on nutmeg, which was, of course, the most valuable spice of all. That's
right. Run's got, you said there's 6 islands with nutmeg, and Run's absolutely heaving with nutmeg, isn't it?
Yeah, and Run, it's important to point out geographically, is the Banda Islands. There's a sort of a cluster of 4 of them, and then 2 of them are much further afield, and that's Pulau Run and Pulau I Island. The most distant of all is Run Island, which is one of the reasons why the Dutch hadn't brought it under their control. They clustered their forts essentially around the main group of islands. And so Nathaniel Courthope and the East India Company sort of sniffed at the opportunity here, and they thought, this island is not yet controlled by the Dutch. And they find themselves, I think even to their surprise, they find themselves reasonably welcomed by the local islanders, who are horrified by what the Dutch are doing to the other islands, and realise that by actually welcoming the English, they might be afforded some sort of protection against the Dutch, who are the ultimate enemy.
But they're slightly unlucky because the Dutch, they're commanded by, I'm going to butcher his name, but Jan Pieterszoon Cohen.
Yes, Cohen. I think it's Cohen.
Cohen, and he seems to be an absolutely terrifying individual.
He's the Dutch Governor General of this whole area, and he's utterly ruthless. I mean, honestly, when you read the accounts of him, he's just a monster. He really is a monster, and he believes, if you need to subjugate an island, the best way to do it is simply to kill everyone who is already living on that island. His brutality is horrific, and honestly, the accounts make quite difficult reading, even today, of what he did. So he is the ultimate enemy, hated of course, by the English, but absolutely hated by the indigenous population, which gives the English a little window of opportunity, because if they can present themselves, as indeed they are, as the enemies of the Dutch, then they have a chance with forging an alliance with the local population.
So Courthope, he's there. how is he sort of fending off the Dutch? Because why can't the Dutch just simply turn up with their greater numbers and just overrun run, if I can put it like that?
Yes, overrun run. Well, actually, it's worth his arrival is quite interesting. He arrives on the 23rd of December, 1616, speaks with the local inhabitants and the local chieftains, and does a deal where the island is placed under English protection. And he says, there's this wonderful line where he says that, and whereas King James was formerly King of England, Scotland, France, and Ireland, he is now also king of Run. And as one wit quipped, that Run would probably ultimately be far more profitable than Scotland had ever been.
Speaking as a Scot.
Now, he didn't have a great deal of weaponry at his disposal, but he did have the cannon on board his ship, and he did have the muskets and whatever they were carrying. And Run was quite easy to defend because on one whole side of the island, it's almost vertical cliffs that rear out of the sea. And there's only one bay where you can really get ships into land. And that's protected by a spit of sort of sand that sticks out into the ocean. And so Nathaniel Courthope rather strategically places cannon in all the right points. And even though the Dutch fleet is enormous, they've got huge naval resources, they've got a vast amount of manpower as well. But they find themselves they repeatedly try to launch an attack against Run, and they are beaten off. And so this is real David and Goliath stuff, And David is a plucky band of English adventurers who are determined to hold on to this island and find it relatively easy, at least in the first months of the siege, to do so.
And you were saying how the Dutch have sort of mixed crews. I was quite interested that the Dutch have Japanese samurai fighting for them at various times.
Yeah, it's extraordinary who they draft in to do their dirty work for them. But really, the name of the game was ruthlessness on the Dutch part. They had absolutely no interest whatsoever in the local indigenous population. They were there to be slaughtered.
So presumably, Nathaniel, he can't hold out forever. So presumably he's hoping for some kind of relief, either because the governments at home are going to come to a deal, or they're going to send out some sort of a relief force, which will make it easier for him to be supplied, to be defended.
That's exactly what he is hoping for. And ultimately, there will be a relief force. A rather large English fleet arrives after he's already been besieged for many, many months by this point. But the new fleet of 11 big English ships sail to the East Indies, and they are under the command of Sir Thomas Dale, who's been made president of the English in the East Indies. So he's the equivalent of Jan Kern, the brutal, murderous Dutch Governor-General. He's a very interesting character, Sir Thomas Dale. He'd been out in Virginia. He'd been instrumental in founding Jamestown. And actually, for those of your listeners who know the story of Pocahontas, he'd actually been the one who brought Pocahontas back to England. In 1611, I think it was. So an interesting character. So he's sent out to the East Indies really to defend English interests there, and also to come to the help of Nathaniel Courthope. Unfortunately, he gets caught up in a huge naval battle at which he is completely worsted, and all of Nathaniel Courthope's hopes of being, having relief brought by this expedition, they are all in vain. Sir Thomas Dale's ships never get near the island of Run. And so Nathaniel Courthope and his dwindling band of men find themselves clinging onto this island with no outside support.
So you would think that at this point, the sensible thing to do would be to give up. To this day, I don't really understand why he doesn't give up, because I think the Dutch offer him some quite decent terms.
It's peculiar, I must admit. He had this sort of dogged determination and a sort of fiery patriotism, I think, that he hated the Dutch, and he was a patriotic Englishman. And I mean, this is how he describes it in his own diary. One has to, I think, take it at face value that he believed in what he was doing. He believed in his English patriotism, and he was determined to hold this against the Dutch. And perhaps also he didn't trust the Dutch, that when they said they'd offer him good terms if he quit, if he threw in the towel, he simply looked around at what Jan Kern was doing elsewhere in the East Indies and simply didn't believe it.
Yeah, because they offered, didn't they, to say, look, if you leave and give up your claim, you can have a ship, you can have your ship, you can have supplies, you can have a hold full of nutmeg, and then bye-bye, we never want to see you again. And it seems like it's hopeless because there's no water supply on Run except what falls out of the sky. There's basically no food. I mean, it just seems incredible that he can. I mean, how long does he hold out in the end?
They hold on, I can tell you exactly, 1,540 days. That is quite a few years that they hold out. And as you say, you're right, there's very little water, there's very little fresh water on Run Island. It has to be brought in barrels from other islands, which is in itself was extremely dangerous undertaking. They also have to bring in food from other islands as well. So it's a remarkable sort of clinging on there onto this tiny little island with, constant attacks from the Dutch who are trying to take control of the place.
There is one thing in his favour, which is not a completely forlorn hope, which is that, as you say, the Dutch are absolutely hated, and from time to time there is a rebellion against them, and Dutch are killed, but then they sort of reassert themselves. So I think Courthope, his hope is that there will be a rebellion on the other island, which the English can help and throw out the Dutch.
Well, yeah, this is actually, you're getting to the hub of the matter here. So at the end of September, beginning of October of 1620, Nathaniel Courthope hears rumours that on Great Banda, which is the biggest island of all, which is the one with a big Dutch fort on it and everything, he hears that there's going to be a massive uprising against the Dutch. And he realizes, as you say, this is his moment of opportunity and he's determined to seize it. And so what he has to do is make contact with Great Banda Island, which is about 12 miles from Run Island, across very treacherous seas. So he sets out under the cover of darkness in a boat, and he's going to try and get ashore and grab Great Banda and try and forge some sort of alliance with the chieftains there. Unfortunately, he is betrayed, and the Dutch find him at sea in his ship. And the last thing we know, spoiler alert, the last thing we know of Nathaniel Courthope is he is attacked by the Dutch, shot, and falls into the sea. In fact, his body was never recovered. So he presumably went to a watery grave.
I hadn't appreciated. We have Courthope's diaries, do we?
Yes, we got quite a lot of his writings. This is the beauty, I have to say, of writing a book about the events in the East Indies, is the East India Company kept absolutely everything, every letter, even personal letters that men wrote to their families. They were sent via the East India Company, copied by the company sort of stenographers or whatever, and then sent out to the families. Diaries were kept. These sea captains, they kept daily logs of what was taking place. There is the most extraordinary wealth of information about this period. And this is a period, I think the East India Company, we're slightly embarrassed about these days. It's never taught at school. We never really hear much about the East India Company. But the Victorians were immensely proud of the East India Company as an achievement. They saw it as the foundation stone of the British Empire. And so all these accounts, these letters, these diaries, etc., were transcribed, they were printed, and there are vast collections of these, which thankfully are pretty easy to read because of the Victorians. And so when I was researching the book, it was a wonderful resource to have daily diaries of the full horrors of what was taking place. And they didn't beat around the bush either. If they captured somebody and tortured them, they wrote about it in great detail in their diaries. And so, I was able to spill all of that into my book.
Yeah, no, some of the book does make quite hard reading in one or two places.
Pretty grisly. I mean, one account of torture is absolutely hideous, but I wanted to include it just to give a sense of the sheer brutality of life out in the East at that time.
Okay, so maybe that takes us on to the events at Aboyna. I mean, is it called the Aboyna Massacre? I think that's what it's known as, because the Dutch have finally conquered the Banda Islands. The English are effectively reduced to a few trading posts. So you would think they would be completely irrelevant at this time, but once again we've got Cohen to blame. He sort of, on his way past, he sort of intimates to the governor that he's pretty sure that the English are cooking up something and that maybe they're going to start a rebellion, and telling him to be on his guard. So do you want to take it on from there?
Yes, I mean, there are only a handful of English traders in the place at the time. But you're absolutely right. I mean, Kern cooks up a conspiracy. He says they're planning something, that they're trying to overthrow the Dutch, and that they need to be arrested and tortured. And what you get is the, as you say, the Aboyna massacre, which is so horrific and so brutal that it will actually send shockwaves right back to Britain, and bring Holland and England to the point of war. Because these traders, entirely innocent, there was no conspiracy whatsoever, were brutally tortured by Jan Kern's henchmen, and in Amboina, they were burnt, they were slashed, they were given water torture. I mean, it's absolutely hideous, and the Dutch kept records of absolutely everything they did to these poor, unfortunate, and innocent individuals. And ultimately, they were all killed. And this, as I say, caused outrage in England. There was a famous John Dryden, the famous poet and writer, wrote a tragedy called Amboina, The Cruelty of the Dutch to the English Merchants. And this became a sort of instant bestseller, and it set out the horror of what took place there. And as I say, this brought the English and Dutch to the point of war.
And I'm not sure I quite got the order of events right, but is it the case that the events at Amboina, they sort of leave the English determined to sort of keep their claim to Run, even though they can't put it into force? They don't give it up. They're going to hang on to it for forever, basically.
Yeah, and this is where actually what you were saying earlier, about the legal claims to these places. This is where their sort of paper document did come in handy, because they would sort of wave it around saying, look, this is ours. We've got a document to prove it. And you're right. Although they didn't control this island, and there seemed to be very little hope of ever getting it back, they would consistently say, Run is ours, and you have no right to be there.
That's again another sort of example of the Dutch ruthlessness, because they say, well, have you seen Run recently?
In terms of chopping down the trees, do you mean? Or
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, whenever there was a whiff of a chance of the English getting control of Run Island again, they'd go there with axes and chop down the trees to make sure there's absolutely nothing of any value for them to be there. But we should probably wind forwards to 1654, given this is part of the story. The Dutch and the English sign a treaty, the Treaty of Westminster, which is where Run does indeed fall back into British hands. And so after a space of decades since the death of Nathaniel Gorthope in 1620, 34 years later, the English get control of Run again. Very, very briefly, it should be said. And that's part of the story of what happens next.
Well, okay, don't leave us hanging. What does happen next?
Well, the English have this island very, very briefly. And then what do the Dutch do? They come and seize it again and take it from the English. And the English in London at the time are so infuriated. The merchants and the merchant adventurers in England are so infuriated. They can't send a fleet out to the East Indies, so they do the next best thing. They send a fleet across to America, and they decide to attack Dutch holdings on the northeast shores of America. And one of those places that they seize and decide to hold is an island which by now has been given the name New Amsterdam. This is, of course, Manhattan Island. And New Amsterdam, well, it's not going to be known as New Amsterdam any longer, because the English, having taken possession of it, rename it New York.
And so presumably there's another of these treaties where people say, oh, well, okay.
Yes, and this is really the ultimate treaty that sort of, well, brings my book to a close, but also brings the story, in a sense, to a close. Because the Treaty of Breda, 1667, is where the Dutch and the English sit down at the negotiating table and they say, look, we've got to work out a lasting peace. How are we going to do this? And it is ultimately decided, the English decide to say to the Dutch, look, you can forever have the island of Run. You've got your 6-pounder islands, you've got your monopoly on Nutmeg, but we, in turn, want to hold on to this island, which we've named New York. And the Treaty of Breda, signed in 1667, sees the legal exchange of these two islands. New York becomes English, and Pulau Run becomes controlled forever by the Dutch.
Have you ever visited Pulau Run?
Oh, I have. Oh, yes. When I write a book, any of my books, but particularly this one, which is so focused on one place, I had to go there. Absolute nightmare to get there. It's literally the Banda Islands, even to this day, are incredibly inaccessible. That when I was there, just before I arrived there was a little sort of Cessna plane that used to fly there from a neighbouring island, but that had crashed a few weeks earlier. And so the only way to get there was by boat. Which was a terrifying journey. That was to the main island, Great Banda. But then I had to get from Great Banda to the island of Pulau Run, which I had to rent a sort of inflatable sort of dinghy with an outboard motor on it and cross 10 miles of sea in the teeth of the monsoon. It was one of the most terrifying journeys of my life. But I got there and it was a little paradise, it has to be said. This tiny little island covered in nutmeg trees. And you can, as I say in my book, you smell the island long before you arrive at it because this smell of nutmeg hangs in the air.
Well, I don't know quite how to put this, but I'm sort of hearing you say about what a terrifying journey it was. I'm wondering how terrifying it must have been for the English being blown out to sea, or the Dutch or the Portuguese or whoever. It must have been absolutely horrific.
I know. I mean, you have to admire these men or think they're completely crazy to go on these voyages. There was a pretty much, at least a 1 in 3 chance that you were going to die on the voyage out there. To actually make it there, survive the attacks by the Dutch and what have you while you were out there, and then get back to England again alive, they were pretty slim, really. But I suppose, why did they do it? Because if you did make it home, you were loaded. You came back with enough cash in your pockets to buy yourself a nice half-timbered dwelling in a posh bit of London, and also dine out on the fabulous stories that you would bring back with you. And it was no accident that many of the men who came back wrote up their stories of all the adventures they'd had, because there was a huge appetite for learning about the exotic tropics of the East Indies.
It was a time of great learning, wasn't it? I mean, there was historians, geographers, so much going on at that time in England.
Yes, I mean, this was, as we call it, the golden age of exploration. There were ships going off to, hitherto undiscovered or unknown islands, countries around the world. And I find it just fascinating to delve into these accounts, because the immediacy of them and the pungency of the language as well, this rich Jacobean language that they use, that you're plunged straight into these voyages. It's wonderful to read them.
I don't want to lapse into cliche, but this is the age of Shakespeare. There's this sort of incredible explosion of energy in England at this time.
Yes, actually, interesting you mentioned Shakespeare, because on one of the East India Company ships, William Keeling, the captain, he loved Shakespeare's plays. They were being written at this time, and he took a printed version of Hamlet on board his ship. And as his men sailed down the coast of West Africa, they put into, it wasn't really a port, it was a sort of swampy harbour that they put into. And all the men were rather bored, having been caught in the doldrums at sea and everything. And William Keeling persuades them all to perform Hamlet. And this is one of the most extraordinary stories. And he puts in his diary very proudly, "We performed the tragedy of Hamlet." This was on the shores of Guinea, off the coast of North Africa. So, I'm not sure what William Shakespeare would have made of that. But anyway, this is the first recorded performance of a Shakespeare play outside of London.
Brilliant. Okay, well, look, we probably better bring it to an end there then. That's fantastic. Just, but before you go, what are you up to now? Because you said you were working on, sounded like more than one project at the moment.
Well, I've always got a number of things on the go, but I'm actually just embarking on a whole new project. And I've moved on from the Second World War. And actually, we've been talking about the voyage of Richard Chancellor and Hugh Willoughby and the icy Northeast Passage. My next book is a big tale of exploration in the Arctic from... it's from about...
Don't feel the need to say if you don't want to say.
Okay, well, I'll just say it's a big tale of Arctic exploration from the early years of the 20th century.
Brilliant. Okay, Giles Milton, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me on.
Well, that's it for today's podcast. Giles Milton, irrepressible and wonderful as ever. If you could leave a review on iTunes, that would be great. Helps get the podcast more listeners. And I hope that you'll join me in the next episode. So goodbye for now.